Hello. In this lecture, we will discuss Japanese art and culture through four periods of cultural history between the middle of the 14th century until the beginning of the 20th century. First, we'll look at the Muromachi period, then the Momoyama, then the Edo, then the Meiji. Japanese culture through these four periods cycled from a more isolationist approach to a more open approach to outside influence, both from regional influences like China and Korea to Western influences like Europe and then ultimately the Americas. Now, Japanese culture has a long tradition of influence mostly from a form of Buddhism known as Zen Buddhism, which focuses on a rigorous self-discipline and personal responsibility. And we see that expressed through the art in the decisions made not necessarily about style or technique, but really more so in the simplicity of designs and then the willingness to perfect those designs through the practice of the work itself. Now, Japanese culture's aesthetic can be described as subtle, with a very nuanced approach to both the use of color and texture and proportions. Now, traditionally, Japanese art and architecture has some similarities because of the influences regionally to what we might see in China or Korea. However, the Japanese tend to focus on art and culture as symbols of the authority of the regional warlords or then later of the authority of the emperor. Now, that finds its expression not in grand, large gestures like we might see in China or in Europe, but with smaller works, smaller structures, simpler structures that are incredibly thoughtful. The Japanese tend to focus on a thoughtful approach versus a grand approach. Now, just to give you an idea of the regional differences of Japanese art, during the time period that we're looking at, Japan was divided into provinces, precincts that were ruled over by warlords in a kind of a traditional feudal system. The warlords used art as an expression of their authority and building for themselves kind of the typical palace type structures, but through a Japanese style. Most of the leadership culturally for the whole of Japan comes from two precincts in the center of the country, one centered, capitaled in what is today Kyoto, and the other centered and capitaled in what is today Tokyo. Now, that does not mean that each precinct didn't have its own stylistic sense. They did, but they're all kind of variations on a theme of the unified approach that we see culturally. Now, the other thing to remember is that what affects Japanese culture and the Japanese approach to culture is the fact that it is a relatively small, compared to its neighbors, island nation. Now, what that means is that they don't have the same resources available that, say, a country like China has with its vast amount of territory. But that also, to a certain extent, works to Japan's cultural advantage because it's much easier for the leader culturally to unify the country in its cultural styles and responses. Now, Zen Buddhism is a particular type of Buddhism that focuses on the individual from a very introverted sense. So a Zen Buddhist will seek to distract the physical body by labor and effort, simplistic, kind of repetitive labors that allow the mind to, through those repetitive, kind of monotonous sort of labors, to seek kind of a calm inner sense. And then we see that it reflected in the architecture of shrines and temples. In Japan, Buddhist shrines and temples tend to be very traditional, very simplistic in their design. They also tend to be made with common traditional materials, wood, stone, and instead of having a highly ornamental or decorative sense, they tend to focus on kind of a clarity and a purity of design. So traditionally in Japan, they used the red lacquer to preserve and protect the wood in these structures, also as a symbol of the authority and of the nobility. Red is, in many cultures, a royal color, as it is in Japan. And so it would be reserved, red would be, for certain structures only, either designated by the warlord or by the emperor when there was one, or, in those special structures like shrines or temples. Now, these buildings are not for a corporate worship. They don't gather to worship together. That's not how Buddhism is practiced. It is very individual. So they're really more for contemplation, for, inspiring the viewer to, and the visitor to take time for meditation, to take time for contemplation and quiet. And so that's really the focus of the overall design. They also concentrated their designs to blend and work with nature. It wasn't intended to be sort of the man's forcing his design sense upon nature. They wanted to make structures that worked with nature and that looked like they belonged in the settings in which they were built. Now, the traditional Japanese pagoda style structure looks similar to what we might see in China. And part of that is because through the as early as the 5th and 6th century, but certainly through the periods after that time, the Japanese were kind of enamored with Chinese style. They looked to Chinese style as influence. And so, to a certain extent, they mimicked that style. Now, we see the long sweeping line of the roof line. We see the upturned edges at the cornices. We see the decorative structural work in the roof supports. But over time, as Japanese style evolves, what will happen is that they will take that theme of the Chinese style and they will experiment and expand upon it and develop it into something different and unique in their own right. But early on in the Muromachi period, we see a heavy Chinese influence. Later, in future periods, we'll see a shift away from that and more towards an earlier Japanese tradition, which has some similarities but also some significant differences. Now, in shrines like these and temples like these, we see another variation that is specific to the Japanese. They favored an architectural sense that allowed for flexibility in usage. So in this case, the walls of the shrine are really doors and panels that can be opened and closed based upon the weather, based upon what's happening at the shrine or temple. If there's a big celebration, they might open all the doors to allow more light, to allow freer access if it's nice weather outside. Now, in terms of the overall structure, you see that the wood is raw. I mean, it's stained, but it's not that red lacquer because this is a different level of structure. This is a very famous work of architecture from the Muromachi period. It's the Kinkajou Pavilion, sometimes referred to as the Golden Pavilion. And this gives us a real sense of what Japanese architecture traditions are like. So this was built for the emperor during the Muromachi period, and it was built as a retreat, kind of a summer palace almost, but not necessarily one for a palace for kind of a summer residence. This was really intended more as a place of celebration and a place for events. So the emperor would host gatherings, parties basically of his friends and court, and have these lavish events at this pavilion. Now, when this was constructed, the architect was very thoughtful about the function and about how it would be viewed and seen and used. You can see that the ground floor level of the structure is painted in and left traditional, the raw wood or stained wood, the kind of typical stucco, white stucco walls. The gold paint and gold adornments don't start until the second and third floor. And the reason for that is because it's a visual. It creates a very striking visual. So you can see that you would think that the emperor would host these gatherings mostly at night. And as the visitors would approach, the structure, it would be lit up on the second and third floors, and the light would be bouncing off of all the gold and glittery, and it would reflect in the water of the lake that it's built upon. And the house itself, the pavilion itself, would seem to shimmer above the ground. The ground level would be very dark or darker, and you would see the reflection of the pavilion in the water, and it would create this very dramatic effect. Now, what that shows us is how thoughtful the Japanese are in getting the details of something like that absolutely correct. So, that's thinking about the use, thinking about the visuals and the experience of the structure and the way that it's going to be used and why it's going to be used and when it's going to be used as part of the design process. Okay, now today we think this way sometimes, but for the Japanese as early as the 14th century, they're already seeing that a building and structure can be dramatic if the architect and designer is thoughtful about how to elevate that structure, how to make it more dramatic in a simple way. This is really not a very complex structure. It's just gets those details just right to do what the building was designed to do. And that's ultimately what marks Japanese art and culture, is this willingness to focus and to be very thoughtful about the design and how it's going to be used. Now, the Japanese also embrace art in a variety of media that is slightly non-traditional, things that we don't really think of traditionally as high or fine art. They elevate these things to that level by their processes and by their thoughtfulness. So what we're looking at here are 4 examples of rock gardens and different types of gardens that the Japanese find particularly beautiful and aesthetic and pleasing, and that represent them culturally. The most famous of these is the garden in the upper right. This is a Japanese rock garden that was originally designed by an unknown Zen Buddhist monk in the 14th century, and would go on for about 500 years to be the template for what a Zen rock garden, dry rock garden, should look like. It's hard to underplay and undervalue the importance of this object and this structure. Now, it's a simple idea, choosing certain rocks for their scale, proportion, textures, values, and then placing around them this bed of very uniform gravel, and then raking that gravel with simple tools to create lines in the gravel and patterns in the gravel, and then being very careful not to disturb the surface as you're doing that work. So as the monks who preserve and maintain the garden, as they rake the rocks to get those textural lines that we see across the surface, they have to be very careful where they step and what they step on and how they don't disturb the surface. They choose every rock, they choose every piece of gravel for its size and shape and texture and color, because they want this uniformity of surface. It's attention to detail. And that's ultimately what one of the other kind of hallmarks of Japanese art and culture is, this attention to detail. And the willingness to be very careful about those details so that something can look and appear completely natural, but it's ultimately been manipulated by man to create the design. In the upper left, we see a garden created based upon a dried stream bed. So again, all of the rocks and boulders have been selected and shaped and chosen so to create this effect. And then within what is suggested to be this dried stream bed, certain types of ground cover vegetation have been planted to augment that effect. In the lower left, the same kind of approach, except with moss. So, for those unfamiliar with it, moss is a very, very slow growing ground cover that requires very specific conditions of moisture, of temperature, of shade to be produced and to survive. And so it's unusual for moss to grow, because it does grow so slowly and is so finicky, to grow in large patches. Most of the time moss grows on tree trunks, on rocks, and sometimes straight on the ground, but it's really rare for it to grow in large sections like you see here. So how this was accomplished is that the designer of the garden has painstakingly collected moss from a natural setting and brought it back to the garden, and then carefully and painstakingly preserved it and maintained it. And that really shows that Zen approach of discipline and personal responsibility, because without a daily maintenance and without a vigilant monitoring of this garden, it would very quickly pass out of existence. That's very typical of the Japanese approach of an ongoing, that Buddhism is about this path to enlightenment, and one achieves that enlightenment through, in the Zen sense, through this discipline and through this focus and being committed, fully committed to whatever the task at hand might be. The lower right, we see what's known as a winter garden. So all the plants, all the materials are selected based upon the need for or based upon how they will look in the winter. Now, that's that seems kind of odd to us because we tend to think of gardening as a spring and summer, maybe even sometimes a fall practice. But for the Japanese, winter is just as much a part of their part of their lives, and so they want to think about what that garden will look like in the winter time, especially in places where winter is a long season, like it is in some areas of Japan. Now, in painting, Japanese in the Muromachi period took a lot of influence from the Chinese. So what we see here is a typical Japanese style painting on a scroll with ink. This is a silk scroll, and it's painted in their kind of typical, very stylized Japanese style, but inspired for sure by the Chinese. And we can see that inspiration in the use of dragons and in some of the figures and the way that they're painted. But one of the significant differences from what you might see in China is the use of the color. The Chinese tended to be less prone to using color, especially strong, more vibrant colors. They tended to focus more on using just blacks and grays. Now, the scene itself is kind of has a typical Japanese feel to it. It's a scene. We see the figure in the left side of the register, who's actually supposed to be an image of the Buddha, and that line that comes down to the top of his head is supposed to represent enlightenment, and he's sort of reaching enlightenment, and he's inspiring others to do the same. Now, the Chinese are heavily influential on the Japanese in bringing to them what's referred to as the calligraphic or calligraphy-based style. But we see that in paintings like this one, focusing on simple subject matter, an iris and leaves and a rock. But one of the major differences between Japanese versions and Chinese versions is the fluidity and elegance of the line work. Chinese line work tends to be very controlled, very patiently and painstakingly planned and created. For the Japanese, they wanted their line work to seem more fluid, to have a kind of a more elegant and length to the lines. It's not quite as busy in Japanese style as we might see in Chinese. But overall, the use of value is similar to what we would see in Chinese. The line itself is relatively similar. The materials are relatively similar to what you might see in the Chinese examples. Now, one of the ways that Japanese differed pretty significantly from the Chinese in painting is in the landscapes. Japanese landscapes are very often considered to be more realistic than what we would see in Chinese, a more realistic sense of the perspective, of the space, of the atmosphere, and we see that very strongly in works throughout all four of the periods that we're going to look at. The Japanese painters understood how to use value, lights and darks, to create modeling, to create shadow and shade and highlight. They understood by observation that the key to realism was in that space and in that practice. Similarly to what we saw in Europe, but not in a color sense, the way we would see in traditional European painting. It was really more in just in value. Now, in paintings like these, this is a Zen patriarch sweeping a broom. We see a genre approach. So it's not about the individual and his identity or as a portrait. It's more about what he represents. And in this case, the action here of the patriarch not so much in being an actual biological father, but he's more of a spiritual father. And he has removed himself from the world. He's up kind of on his mountaintop in his little shack, and he's focusing on this mundane, monotonous task of sweeping with the broom to free his mind, to distract his body, to free his mind, so he can meditate on enlightenment. Now, we might look at this and think that overall there's some relatively realistic areas, but the realism kind of falls flat in certain spots, like with the kind of clouds and the little the mountaintops emerging out of the clouds and being shrouded. But what's interesting about that is how realistic that actually is to some of these regions. The mountains and clouds work this way in many areas, many of the more mountainous areas of Japan. The clouds will hang low over the mountains and create this kind of misty, foggy approach. And we're very familiar with that here. We see it regularly around our mountains. And so we can relate. But initially a lot of people saw this and thought that it might be some sort of allegorical kind of mystical meaning, but no, this is what the landscape very often actually looks like. Now, as we move into the Edo period, first the Momoyama period. So moving to the Momoyama period, what we see is a shift away from the traditional and more towards kind of an opening to outside influences, specifically some influences of European style. Japan, unlike some of its neighbors, was visited more regularly by European traders and travelers, being an island, and they were also willing, because they were an island and they were used to ship travel, they were willing to explore outside of their own territories. And so they sent envoys to Europe and to other places, and they brought back tales and stories about what they saw there, and then they incorporated some of those ideas into their own designs. So this is called Himeji Castle, and we see in it a grander, much grander expression of architecture. We see a lot of traditional Japanese tendencies of the way that they used that arched roof, the way that they used the multiple roof lines, the way that they used the pagoda kind of overall tiered structure. But there's also some elements that are not very typical Japanese. One is the scale. That Japanese didn't tend to build these larger palatial structures, at least not traditionally. Another is the level of decorative detail, all the gold work, all the sculptural details. Those are kind of atypical for most traditional Japanese. But what's interesting about this is how during the period, there's a lot more openness, and we see different cultural shifts, different cultural influences, but everything is always filtered through that Japanese stylistic tendencies. So even when we see them kind of branching out and embracing things from other cultures, they're always going to filter it through their own sense and style, and it will be undeniably Japanese. Now, sometimes it can be a bit confused because it's not traditional Japanese, and it goes against what we would kind of expect, especially as we move forward closer to later periods. Now, in painting, one of the strong influences we see here comes really more from China. This is during this period, the Momoyama period. There's a heavy influence of the Chinese works of Busan and others who favored this very kind of minimalistic approach. And we see that at work here. These trees sort of emerge out of this hazy, very simple composition. The works like this one have a lot of negative space, which is typical of what you would see in Chinese style painting, especially scroll painting. But the difference here is that the Japanese use this, and the scale is a little bit larger. So this is a panel, it's a very large panel. And some of these panels were used as room dividers, as screens for decoration. And so, the scale of these is quite large versus what we might see typically in China, which would be considerably smaller. But overall, the techniques are very similar. And we see a lot of use of different values, darks and lights, some intense darks and very, very subtle middle values against the sort of raw silk of the panel. Now, others of these screens and panels could be quite colorful. It was actually common in the period for artists to create these panels in a set that based upon and inspired by the seasons. And so what you would do is you'd have four, so if you had a room divider in your house, you might have four of these panel sets that you could switch out depending upon the season, spring, summer, winter, fall. And it would give you a little bit of variety in your decoration, but also it would kind of match the feeling of the time of year. So here's spring with all its blooming and flowering and the birds doing their mating displays and rituals and the bright colors on this gold background. It's still stylized. We still see some Chinese influence for sure, but it's definitely filtered through that Japanese approach of use of color and the overall kind of sense and style that is really very Japanese. So as you move through the year, you would change out these panels, and the birds would change, and the decoration would change, and the setting would change, but the style would continue throughout. And really, these are similar to what we might see in Europe in the form of tapestries or weavings that would hang on the walls and be used to decorate the interiors. Decorative art in Japan, like the gardening, like some of the other media, wasn't seen as something kind of beneath other higher, what we might think of as higher art forms. Now, sometimes there's actually a very direct Chinese influence. And in this case, this is a pair of Chinese lions that painted by a Japanese painter. And so he's very specifically copying famous Chinese example of some lions painted by a famous Chinese painter from the period, but you can definitely tell that this is Japanese because of the very graphic style, the exaggeration of the figures, the repetitive patterns that are stylized and elongated and elegant. All of that happening on that kind of gold background with different values. This is very typical Japanese painting of the Momoyama period. Now, during this time, there's a school, a famous school of painting that we see the leader of that school is the painter of this scene, Cuckoo Flying Over New Verdure. And these paintings, that's the one on the right, there's another painting by the same artist on the left. These paintings show what for them was a relatively new technique to use, one that they learned from China and Korea, to use a kind of a washed background, a layering of color and value to create instead of having hard edges and lines, it creates kind of a softer, more abstract, kind of painterly feel. And then into that and over the top of that, you superimpose the lines and shapes of whatever your subject matter and depiction might be. Now, this is going to be later very influential on the Japanese painters of the future, as they will return to this style later during the Edo period, and then eventually in the Meiji period. They're inspired by these artists who create these very kind of ethereal, very painterly works. Now, during this period, during the Edo period and then into the Meiji period, we see the rise of printmaking as an important art form in Japan. And some scholars believe that this is a reflection of the influence of the Dutch traders. They brought simple graphic prints with them and perhaps showed Japanese artists how to use woodblock printing, although there's some evidence that the Japanese were already doing woodblock prints, but perhaps not quite at that highest level. Now, as we move into the Edo period, what happens is that this openness changes, and we cycle back through a kind of a more isolationist period. And in that isolationist period, it's really not isolationist in terms of separating, permanently anyway, the Japanese from outside cultures, but it's an attempt to preserve a more nationalistic, more Japanese sense to their culture, to try and kind of return to their roots, perhaps, or traditions. And one of the ways that they do that was to try and inspire average people to feel a pride, a nationalism in Japan, and which, whenever there's a more global perspective, usually what we end up with is an effect, positive sometimes, negative sometimes, on culture. But when we shift towards this more kind of isolationist approach, or individualistic approach culturally, preservationist approach perhaps, what we end up with is an art that tries to get to the root of what it means to be whatever that culture is. So what does it mean to be Japanese? And so this is by Hokusai, who's considered one of the most important Japanese artists ever. And this comes from a series of 36 woodblock prints that he did. This is that all focus on Japanese traditional techniques, subject matters, concepts, and allegories. And one of the things that Hokusai was really a master at was animating kind of the natural to give this effect, to create this making these natural things feel like they're characters almost. So this is called the Great Wave off Kanagawa. And here the water has these kind of tendril-like hands, like it's grabbing the boats and trying to sink them. And here, the Japanese, they head out into the waves. Despite the, perhaps good sense or challenging fate, and that's so what the message is that the Japanese are courageous, that they're strong, and that they're willing to do what's necessary to brave these waves. And of course, in the background stands like the sentinel, like the iconic image that it is, Mount Fuji. Again, an iconic natural landmark in Japan that has come to represent Japan. Now, this is a very intricate process, this woodblock printing. Each one of those colors is its own block. It has to be printed absolutely perfectly with register to get all the color in the exact right place. But the benefit is the artist can make multiple prints from these blocks to create a number of these works, which allows him to reach a wider audience because they can be printed more cheaply, and they can be sold more cheaply, and more people can collect them, which allows them to be more and more popular. Now, that popularity also is boosted by the subject matter, by making things that allow for patriotism and populist pride. That tends to that subject matter tends to also be more popular. Now, in this series, we see Hokusai trying to represent what he sees as the character, the nature, and the identity of the Japanese people. They come to aid in times of need. Here we have all these villagers coming out to rescue these folks who've been injured and uprooted by these waves, by the tsunamis, by the typhoons that are definitely a part of the natural life of these island people. Again, Fuji in the background. Now, Hokusai's style is one that's very graphic, strong outlines, flat planes and areas of color. And the idea here is that he's trying to create a simple style that's easy to recognize. And actually, there's a lot of artists and historians who believe that Hokusai is very inspirational in the style of Japanese animation common today that we refer to as anime. He also chose as his subject traditional Japanese practices and social norms like the tea house. And so here we have these men who are lounging at the tea house, and this was a big part of Japanese culture, kind of like the pubs of Great Britain, or the cafes of France, or the piazzas of Italy. For the Japanese, the tea house was a place to gather, to socialize, to have conversation, and then of course to just relax. And so he's celebrating that because it was kind of falling out of favor and fashion, but for him, this is at the heart of what it means to be Japanese. Now, as we move into the Meiji period, which begins in the late 19th century, carries over to the early 20th century, just before the build-up to World War II, what we're going to see is we're going from that isolationist close off to more open to the West, specifically open to try and what they considered was to update Japanese culture to make it put it on par with what they saw in Europe and America. So in the late 1860s, early 1870s, the Japanese brought outsiders specifically to Japan to help them make these changes culturally, socially, politically, militarily, in all ways, to update everything Japanese, to bring them into the new age, the modern age. And so what that means for us culturally is a time period where Japan is going to be trying to find itself. It's not Europe. It's not the West. It's not America. And so because of that, when they try and do things like or inspired by or influenced by Western culture, it's going to seem kind of confused. It's not typical Japanese. It's not, it might be inspired by, but it's not typical to the culture that it comes from. So, to make an English manor house, to make a Victorian house, to make an Italianate house or structure, to make, all of that is going to feel kind of forced and confused. And so what we end up with is an architectural style in particular. It's a little different in painting, but an architectural style that seems not to fit any of those. It's just sort of trapped in between this clash of cultures. So, here, this is an attempt to create by a Japanese designer, architect, and builder to create something inspired by or influenced by perhaps something you might see in northern France or Belgium. You can see the very French, very orderly approach to the garden, to the hedges. They're trimmed and shaped neatly to the path and walkway. The foundation and masonry works very flat, even, and there's a distinct front entry. There's the awning over the entry. There's the upper floors and rooms, the multiple stories, the roof line. So it's got a little bit of the Japanese and a little bit of the European and mixed together to create something that is sort of both and neither at the same time. Ultimately, what we come away with are a bunch of structures that make it clear that the Japanese are trying to mimic what they see, hear, talk about, and visit, and when they visit Europe, but they don't fit culturally. So this is a typical Japanese approach to a Victorian English style home. Right down to the English garden out front. That's a very, very typical approach to an English garden, this sort of abundance of the natural flowers and everything kind of everywhere, but surrounded by that hedge and divided. The difference here is that in England, this house would have a wide veranda front porch, typically for kind of the English way of visiting and welcoming visitors to sit outside on the porch, so that neighbors might be received and visitors might be received in that way. Well, in Japan, that makes no sense because it would be seen as an insult to ask a visitor to ask someone to sit outside. The very first thing you'd always do with a visitor is welcome them in, offering them a tea. It's a very hospitable and society, and so it's hard even to see where the front entry is because it doesn't have what we would expect it to have in that sense. But of course, it's got the Victorian Tower, and it's got the gables, and it's very little of it that actually feels much in any way of Japanese. But again, it's not really effectively English either, or Victorian either. This is a completely confused structure. The main body of the house is Italianate, kind of sort of like something you might see in the 19th century in Italy, or in actually maybe more likely what you'd see in England of someone trying to look Italian. So think about what that says, is we have a Japanese person trying to build something that matches the English, trying to look Italian. So here we have the ultimate clash of cultures. The main body of the house is definitely Italianate, with the columns, with the pediment, with the dentil, with the way that the windows are flanked by the arches and the kind of arched pediments. It even has that Baroque sort of faux dome, or Italian Baroque style dome over the central entryway. And then on the end, you see the Victorian Tower, of course, built all out of stone, like a good Italianate structure would be. The main entry is actually covered by something that would be on the side in a true structure like this. That wouldn't be actually an entryway. It would be, and you can see even the path there, that they wouldn't put this on the front of the house. They put it on the side of the house because that's for the carriages. So it's completely confused. But, and we definitely wouldn't expect to see this in Japan. But this is what they were trying to make themselves seem less Japanese and more cosmopolitan, like they saw what was happening in Europe and America. Now, in terms of painting in the Meiji period, there's a radical shift, just like in architecture, a radical shift away from traditions. No more ink on scroll, no more ink on silk. Now we're going to have oil on canvas. And this is a very difficult change for them, because what we end up with is Japanese subject matter, Japanese sensibility and aesthetic, but filtered through European techniques. So here we have the courtesan, but because it's Japanese, she's a geisha. And everything about this painting is sort of typical of what you might see as European influence. The layering of the oil paint, the use of light and dark, the sort of haloing of light around the figure that merges into that softer background. The impasto, the thickness of the paint on the surface, all of those things that are not typical to Japanese art, but that we see because they're trying to mimic what they see in Europe. Now, the reason why these artists were doing that is because the Japanese wanted to seem like they were at the forefront, like they were the equals of what was happening in Europe and in America. Now, as we can, debate its success, but what's interesting is that this sort of ushers in a new age of modernism in Japan. But they never do completely lose the Japanese sensibility. So here, even though this is an oil on canvas, it still has an element, a familiarity of that calligraphy, a familiarity of that use of elegant lines. It's just surrounded by this more kind of traditional oil painting approach. And again, reflecting the landscape of Japan. These are places and spaces and objects typical in Japan, not trying to choose European subject matter, but use European techniques. So, the Japanese don't really have a tradition of still life. So how do you explain and convince a Japanese person to, collect, to appreciate a still life painting? Well, you have to give them something familiar. So if I do a still life, a Japanese painter tries to do a still life of a European subject, it's going to seem hollow and like it's denying their culture. So instead you paint, in your still life, you paint tofu. You paint those things that the Japanese people would at least be familiar with in terms of subject, but you paint them in a more European style and with European techniques. So what I think is important for us to finish out with in our understanding of Japan is that Japanese culture, perhaps unlike the Chinese, unlike some of the other Asian cultures, their colonial approach, or they didn't have that kind of colonial influence the way some of the others did, because they were able to maintain their independence for the most part, but that doesn't mean that they didn't feel the inspiration or feel the influence of outside cultures. They vacillated back and forth between focusing primarily on Japanese traditions and then being open and embracing those outside influences. All right.